Our training today is brought to your partners over at Ventura County. And today we are so happy to be joined by Micah Bailey, one of their business solutions specialists, who's here to share more about the resources available to employers like you. Good morning, Micah.
Thanks, Anna. Good morning, everyone. My name is Micah Bailey. I'm seeing some familiar folks in the room, but for those of you who I haven't met, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm a business solution specialist at the Workforce Development Board, and it's my role to support employers such as yourself access the variety of no-cost employer services that we have with your hiring and training and retention. Um, I'm going to be dropping a link for our digital flip book. Feel free to look through that for an at a glance review of all the different services that we have at a high level. I'd love to speak to you one on one to learn more about your business needs and make that connection to the next step on how we can actually support you with recruiting or with tax incentives, things like that. And if you are interested in that conversation, I'll also put my contact information in the chat as well, and we'd be happy to support your business. In the meantime, I'll hand things back over to Anna. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Micah. Thank you, Cynthia, and your entire team for everything that you do for employers in Ventura County. So now I'd love to introduce our trainer today. We have Eli Nunez, one of our amazing HR directors. So you are in great hands. And Eli, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you, Micah, and welcome everybody. Thanks to the Ventura County Workforce Development Board too for partnering with us and allowing us to bring this presentation to you. Once again, I'd like to remind you if you have any questions, whether it's about this presentation or anything else HR related, please give us a call at that hotline 888-763-3174. Monday through Friday from 8 to 5, except for holidays, so we will be closed on Monday, but you can always leave us a message and we'll get back to you ASAP to make sure that we are helping you out with anything that you need. And speaking of we, you may be wondering who is this we that Eli's talking about. We are California Employers Association. We manage the hotline for Ventura County. We partner with them to help bring you webinars such as this, as well as other resources. Our goal as CEA is to provide anyone that we interact with a peace of mind. We know that HR is very complicated, especially in California with changing laws and changing court orders and that sort of thing. So we're here to help bring some clarity. Again, you can give us a call at the hotline anytime if you have any questions about an HR issue, about wage and hour, or even if you just have a situation you want to talk through with somebody. Sometimes that helps just to talk about something to clear things up. That's what we're there for. So give us a call whenever you need us, and we will do our best to bring you that peace of mind that we strive for. One thing I would like to add, though, is that even though there are some people on our team with legal experience, we are not lawyers. We are not a legal, we don't offer legal advice, and things such as this training are more for educational purposes and should not be taken as legal advice. So we always recommend that if you have any questions of a legal nature, you consult with legal counsel. If you have an attorney that you work with, you can get a hold of them. Otherwise, we have some that we could recommend to you as well that work throughout the state so they can offer you advice in that area or that arena. So, having said that, now that we got the fine print out of the way, let's jump right into our content. Talk about natural disasters and some things to consider as employers in the state of California now. As you know, I mean, it's been on the news lately, right? We're right in the middle of we're starting fire season now in California. It's been warm, it's been windy. There's already a couple fires going on, so that's one of the things that we can face as employers here in the state of California. Now, that's not all. On top of that, we do have storms, flash flooding. I keep hearing the news that it's going to be a super Nino year this year, so there could be some weird weather, whether it's extended drought, extended heat, or even some more drastic weather when wintertime rolls around. So, of course, that triggers other things, especially down there in Southern California. We could be dealing with mudslides. And of course, California wouldn't be California if we didn't have earthquakes, right? So, there are those to consider as well. And it seems like these things have been increasing year after year, whether it's because of changing weather patterns, changing conditions, more population, or just the fact that we're becoming more aware of them with more news and resources. Whatever the case is, there is a lot of things to deal with in the state. So, they affect us as residents, but also employers in the state of California. And the thing about that is, when we do have a natural disaster that occurs in a certain area or certain town, it doesn't necessarily just confine itself to that area, right? I mean, we do always have people that commute from other towns that could be affected, or, maybe we do business in other areas that could be affected by these situations. So again, there's always a natural ripple effect that occurs whenever there is a natural disaster in the state, whether it's dealing with evacuation zones or air quality issues. I remember a couple years back we had those big fires in Northern California, and it seemed like all the smog and all the pollutants just seemed to settle into the valley. So, sure, you have the same effect throughout the state because of different things, right? On top of that, whenever we have a natural disaster, it could have an effect on our utilities. So we could have things such as rolling blackouts or completely lose electricity or utilities for an extended amount of time, as well as, other things that come with it. I mean, you have emergency vehicles coming and going, debris and contamination, roads being blocked, rerouting, that sort of thing. So again, not only does that affect us as a business because we can't conduct our business we usually do, whether it's going into these areas or dealing with clients there, but a lot of us, remember, we have employees that live in different areas of the state. So again, it could affect them directly by maybe damaging or affecting their homes or even their ability to come to work, or even if they're not there, they could have relatives there, family, children, parents, whatever it is, that they need to help at that time. So, as an employer, it's important to consider how these issues that occur, whether it's near us or throughout the state, how they may have an impact on us as a business, our employees, or our clients. So, always be looking ahead of that and then trying to stay ahead of it, if you will. Let's talk a little bit about health and safety considerations when it comes to natural disasters. Of course, the business, our primary concern is always the health and safety of our employees, our clients, anybody that basically comes under our care, if you will, for lack of a better word, right? So there are protections for employees in the labor code, specifically Labor Code Section 1139. And basically, what this does is if there is an adverse or an emergency condition that is affecting employees or affecting the workplace, this protects your employees from any adverse action for refusing to come to work or for leaving the work site. So, I'll give you a drastic example. For instance, if there is a tornado near your place of work, employees are protected from refusing to come to work if it's affecting your direct area or your direct vicinity, or from leaving the work site as needed. So all that is needed is for the employee to have a reasonable belief that their safety is at risk, right? And of course, what is a reasonable belief? Well, if there's a storm 5 towns away and the employee says, well, this storm might come over here, that could be a stretch, right? But if it's something that's happening directly to your work area or to your work site, that could definitely be considered an unreasonable belief. And as an extension of that too, it's also against the law for you as an employer to direct an employee to enter or remain in an area that's subject to mandatory evacuation. So for instance, if your place of business is in an evacuation zone and everyone's been asked to leave, but you ask your employee to go back and pick up some files or some equipment or something, again, that is against the law. So whenever there is a mandatory evacuation of an area, that means everybody gets out, and you can't order anybody to go back for business purposes until it has been cleared by the local authorities. Now, a little more clarification in what an emergency condition means. Now, there was a very clear distinction made for this a couple of years ago, that an emergency condition does not include a health pandemic, even though there could be other protection involved with that. And as you can imagine, this definition or this distinction came about during the COVID pandemic that basically hit the country, right? And this was put in because a lot of people said, well, you know what, COVID's going on, I'm not coming to work. And the state said, well, hang on, pump the brakes there. Just the fact that there is a pandemic going on does not necessarily mean that employees can refuse to come to work, as long as employers are following the right precautions and following any specified OSHA requirements to make a safe workplace, right? So keep that in mind. I mean, emergency condition does not include a health pandemic, but what it does include is any condition where there's a natural disaster or that causes extreme danger or peril for the safety of your employees or anybody there. And that could be either caused by a natural disaster, storm, tornado, earthquake, fire, whatever it is, or a criminal act. If there's some kind of criminal act going on in your workplace, active shooter, that sort of thing, that can count as an emergency condition. So, this emergency condition is also extended to other areas outside of the workplace. So, for instance, if one of your employees is notified that the area around their home has an evacuation order or their child's school has an evacuation order, then they can also refuse to come to work to address that and not have any adverse conditions. So, for example, if there's a wildfire that's affecting their child's school or a flood, earthquake, or even an active shooter, that basically would qualify as an emergency condition where an employee can leave to deal with that without facing any adverse action. And by adverse action, I mean being written up for leaving work, receiving a point for an absence or that sort of thing. Additionally, keep in mind that employees also have the right to access their mobile phones or any other communication device in the event of an emergency. So if they're in need for emergency assistance, they have to call 911 or they have to, contact local authorities or something. They have the right to do that on their mobile device. Reason I mention this is because, a lot of them of workplaces sometimes have policies that state, you cannot use your mobile device at work or you cannot have your mobile device with you. Well, this is an exception to that. Employees can use their mobile devices in the event of an emergency. Again, that could be for something as simple as grabbing their phone to call 911, call the police, or even, to call in and check with somebody in case there is an emergency condition or some kind of natural disaster going on. On top of this, too, your employees should also have access to a telephone with an outside line. In other words, they should always be able to communicate outside of the workplace in case of an emergency. Now, this is fairly easy nowadays because it seems like almost everybody has a mobile device or a cell phone that they can access at work to call out. But again, you should take that into consideration anytime you're creating a work area or if you have employees that work on site or even agricultural sites, right? Maybe your employees don't all have cell phones, so you have to be sure that maybe the supervisor that's on site always has a mobile device or a way to communicate either with you or with emergency services, or somebody there does, or they have access to some kind of communication device there so they can get a hold of somebody in case of an emergency. And this could be in case of a natural disaster, in case of a medical emergency, in case of heat stress or anything like that. You want to make sure that employees always have a way to communicate um, in case there is some kind of emergency at the job site. Now, some additional legislation that California has as far as protection and something that applies basically throughout the state now that, fires seem to happen regularly. It's not a question of will a wildfire happen, but it's more a question of when will it happen. So, basically, the OSHA, the occupational or Cal OSHA, put in some regulations in place stating that whenever there's a certain level of particulates in the air, then you should anticipate that employees will be exposed to wildfire smoke, right? And again, we saw this a couple years back when the wildfires hit up here in Northern California. It looked I don't know, for lack of a better word, looked kind of apocalyptic, right? It looked like a sci-fi movie where the sky was, bright red throughout the day, and it seemed like there was smoke and haze everywhere. There was a run on air purifiers at the store, that sort of thing. So, again, keep that in mind. For employees that work outside, there are these regulations in place to protect them from being exposed to these particulates in the air from any kind of smoke inhalation while they're out there. There are some exceptions to this requirement, and that includes, when employees are working completely enclosed buildings or vehicles with air filtration. In other words, if they work indoors and there's some kind of air circulation device that filters the air conditioning, air filters, that sort of thing, then the protections for the wildfire smoke regulation would not kick in. Um, If they're exposed for 1 hour or less, in other words, if they're only exposures when they're moving from one job site to another, then the protections may not kick in at that point. And of course, if they're firefighters, firefighters, unfortunately, part of their job or part of their duties are to be exposed to wildfire or smoke. So, they are not necessarily covered by the protections or the regulations um, identified in this measure. Now, there are some requirements that come along with this. Of course, you have to identify harmful exposures. In other words, be aware of the different conditions. Have a method of communicating that to your employees. So whether it's, the morning meeting, if you have outdoor employees where everybody does like a tailgate or something, you communicate what the conditions are going to be for the day. You should provide training and instruction to both your employees and your supervisors so they can identify any hazardous situation and know how to react or what measures to take. And of course, have some kind of control for harmful exposures. That could be things like maybe changing work schedules, adding more rest periods, or providing N95 masks for employees to use while they are working in those conditions. Something else to keep in mind too is that Cal OSHA does have some regulation or some requirements for the cleanup or the accessing of work areas after a natural disaster. And a lot of these, as you can imagine, have to do with any hazards that are caused by or that linger after a natural disaster. Of course, one of the most dangerous is any kind of electrical damage or electrical exposure. And what Cal OSHA states is that only qualified electrical workers may work on downed power lines. This seems like common sense, of course, but a lot of times if we're driving to work or, we pull into the work parking lot, and there's a down power lines, a lot of us think that, hey, well, we have this long broom or this long, stick that we can use to move it out of the way and make it safe. Please make sure that you are aware as employers and that your employees are aware that no one but qualified electrical workers should work on down power lines. And as an employer, do not order your employees to do anything unless they are qualified electrical workers having to do with down power lines. Um, if there's been any water damage or water exposure in your electrical circuits, make sure that the main breaker or fuse for the service panel is turned off and leave it off until a qualified person can inspect it to make sure that it is safe to restore power to the building. And if you have a work area, whether it's a warehouse or your offices that have been damaged by fire, make sure that it's examined by certified personnel or an engineer before allowing your employees to enter again. Make sure that it's been cleared as safe to be accessed by your employees. Now, we do have a bit.ly there for wildfire cleanup with some information on there. If you're in one of those areas that could be affected by wildfire or that's something that you're dealing with, make sure you take a look at that. A lot of the questions that we get on the hotline when dealing with emergencies have to do with wage and hour, of course, especially, how do I pay my employees or do I have to pay my employees if their job has been affected by a natural disaster? And the first thing that comes into play, of course, and when we talk about what happens if employees have to go home early or have to cut their day short, is reporting time pay. And this applies to non-exempt or hourly employees. Basically, what the law says is that any non-exempt employee that reports to work for the regular shift and works less than half of their scheduled shift have to be paid for at least half of their scheduled shift, but never less than 2 hours or more than four. So in other words, you get paid less, at least half of your scheduled shift, as long as it's more than 2 hours, but you don't have to pay more than 4 hours for that reporting time pay. And that is, if someone shows up to work and if you have any work for them for some reason, you send them home, you have to pay them for half of their shift or at least 2 hours, right? Um, Now, if you call somebody in on a day they're not normally scheduled to work, and you don't give them a set schedule. So in other words, if I have the day off on Friday and my office calls me in and says, hey, I need you to come in on Friday, it's like, okay, I show up and I only work for half an hour before I'm sent home. I have to be paid at least 2 hours of pay. Now, the exception to this is if you talk to somebody, call them and say, hey, can you come in for 1 hour tomorrow to reboot the servers or something like that? Then my schedule is only for 1 hour, so I would only be paid for 1 hour for that day. So keep that in mind. If you do have to call somebody in on a day they're not scheduled, um, make sure you, if possible, define what hours they will be working for that day, especially if it's only like a very short period. If you only need them to come in for, half an hour to let somebody, the utilities in and lock up after them or something, make sure that you define that in the beginning. Let them know, hey, I need you to come in tomorrow for a half-hour shift or for a 1-hour shift just to do X, Y, and Z. Now, there are some exceptions to having to pay that reporting time pay. And as you can imagine, some of these do have to do with natural disasters. But first, the first one is if the employee voluntarily chooses to leave. So, in other words, if everybody shows up in the morning and you realize you don't have work for everybody and you say, hey, things are kind of slow today. Does anybody want to go home? And, three people say, yep, we want to leave. Guess what? They voluntarily left, so they are only paid for the time they were actually there. That reporting time pay does not kick in because they voluntarily chose to leave. And that's a big exception, right? Sometimes employees come in and things are slow, and the manager says, "Hey, things are kind of slow. Does anybody want to go home?" They say, "Oh, I'll go home," and then they expect to be paid for after shift. It's like, no, you volunteered to leave, so that reporting time pay does not apply at that point. The other one, and the one that applies more to what we're talking about today, is if operations can't start because of threats to employee or public safety. So, in other words, if there's a fire, if there's a, earthquake, if there's some kind of flood or anything like that, basically, public utilities are off, if there's a blackout, anything that could be classified as an act of God, right, like a natural disaster, basically anything that's outside of the employer's control, that means that you're exempt from having to pay that reporting time pay because it is out of your control as an employer as to why, work cannot take place or work cannot start. Now, keep in mind, don't interpret that too broadly, right? For instance, if there's a heavy rainstorm, but the business still has functioning utilities, electricity, etc., then that's not necessarily a reason enough to be exempt from that reporting time pay, right? So, again, it's important to take a look at the weather, but you know, for instance, I mean, if you're a farmer, right, and you turn your employees away because they can't do any work because of the rain, um, it doesn't necessarily rise to the level of natural disaster. Just rain doesn't rise to that point. So you would still have to pay them reporting time pay. So in order for this exemption to be valid, it has to be something that is a huge disruption to the business and classified as a natural disaster, right? Fire, flood, that sort of thing. Just a rain or a storm may not rise to this level. So again, not all weather related events will qualify for this exception. So make sure that that does rise to a level of natural disaster if you're not going to pay reporting time pay. Safe, the safe thing to do, of course, is always to pay that reporting time pay. But if you have any questions about a specific situation, give us a call. We could talk through it to see what the best course of action is at that point. Now, reporting time pay is also required if you send an employee away and then tell them to come back later. So for instance, you tell them if things slow down at noon, you say, okay, we'll go home or leave and come back at 4. You have to pay them at least 2 hours for that second shift. And on top of that, they may also be able to split shift premium. Now, we have created a table for CEA members to break down what a split shift premium is, but if you're not sure if you have a split shift premium, if you have employees that work a little bit in the morning, a little bit in the evening, or what have you, give us a call. We could talk through the specific situation. A lot of things come into play, how much of a break was there in between, how much the employee makes per hour, that sort of thing. Now, speaking of wages too, a lot of you may be familiar with the wage theft notices, or that's you know, wage or Form 2810.5. Basically, that's the one that we should be giving to all our non-exempt new hires. That kind of lets them know, this is how much you make per hour. This is your paid sick leave. There should also be a section in there that's called an emergency or disaster disclosure. And what this means is that if there's been a declaration of a emergency declaration within 30 days before their first day of employment that may affect their health, they need to be notified of that. So in other words, if there was a wildfire within 30 days of them starting and there was, a lot of smog or a lot of smoke around, you have to notify your employees of that, right? Um, but of course, it's just common sense, right? You want to inform your employees whenever there are some hazards or there could be some hazards occurring. So that's basically what this new section of Form 2810.5 did. It made it so mandatory for employers to inform their employees of any kind of hazardous conditions that occurred or that occurred recently or that could occur in the job site. Now, so far we've been talking about non-exempt or hourly employees. When it comes to exempt employees, things are a little different, of course. Exempt employees are paid as salary on a weekly basis, so to speak, regardless of their hours that they work per day. So again, they're paid that flat weekly salary, and so which means if they show up to work and you send them home, you're paying them for the whole day. It's not affecting their salary because their salary is not based on how many hours they work or how many hours they show up or what have you. You can't deduct any pay for partial day absences, whether it's related to a natural disaster or other reasons, even though you can deduct any PTO that they have available. So in other words, if I come in for 3 hours as an exempt employee and say, okay, well, I'm not feeling well, I have to go home, and I have 5 hours of sick time available, my employee can automatically deduct those 5 hours of sick time to make up for the rest of the day. However, if I do not have any paid sick leave or any vacation time available and I leave after 1 or 2 hours, I must still be paid my entire pay for the day. In other words, you can't deduct any partial salary from me for being absent for part of that day. Now, the only difference for this, if there's no work performed at all for a full work week, then the law does allow for that full work week to be deducted from the exempt employee. But if it's just 1 or 2 days, um, then that's not necessarily possible. Something else to consider when there are natural disasters is if any leaves of absence apply or how these leaves of absences interact with these natural disasters. And the first one we talk about when we talk about leaves of absence, of course, is California paid sick leave. You know, a lot of people think of as PTO, but what it is really a mini leave of absence, right? It's permitted under law. So we've talked about this I'm sure you've heard about this over and over. Employees get 40 hours or 5 days per 12-month period, whichever is more. It could be accrued or it could be given all at once, whatever it is. And what the uses for it are, right? Basically to care for parent, child, spouse, registered domestic partner, the employee themselves, et cetera, et cetera. On top of that, they can use it for things like jury duty, victims of a crime, that sort of thing. Well, there has been some more adjustments to this. As of January 1st of last year, agricultural employees who work outside can use paid sick leave in case there's heavy smoke, heat, or flooding conditions due to a local or state emergency. And that includes, when the job site is closed due to those events. So, before we are talking about reporting time pay could be canceled if the job site is closed because of emergency. Well, if you are an agricultural employee, you're allowed to use your paid sick leave for those times. So in other words, if I'm an ag employee, I'm working, we're harvesting, I think apricots are in season right now, and I show up and, we're all sent home because there's a fire nearby and there's a lot of smoke, I can use any available paid sick leave to pay for that missed time. Now, speaking of paid sick leave, keep in mind, of course, we are all familiar with California's requirements, 40 days or 5 hours, or 5 days or 40 hours, whichever is more, et cetera, et cetera. But there are some local ordinances throughout the state that offer more protection beyond what the state mandates. So, in other words, there's certain areas in the state that either grant more than 5 days or 40 hours, or that allow a higher carryover from year to year, or possibly, different usage. So, most things are in large metro areas in northern and southern California. Up in Northern California, I always think about San Francisco, San Jose, the Bay Area. They do have a lot of protections. Down in Southern California, LA, the city of Los Angeles, San Diego, some other cities down there could have other requirements. So if your area where your business is located doesn't have any specific, exemptions or high requirements, keep them in mind anyways in case you do have employees that either work remotely or work in other areas, because those protections and those additional protections or rights do apply depending on where the work is being performed. So the example I always give is if you run a landscaping business, and you could maybe where your office is based, there are no additional protections, but you send your employees to work in a metro area that does have additional protections, then they are subject to all those additional protections. So whether it's regarding paid sick leave or minimum wage or whatever it is, be aware when you're sending your employees to these larger areas, um, of what the additional protections are, so you are providing them to them and don't get into trouble because for not doing it. Next leave of absence, of course, we have is both CFRA, the California Family Rights Act, and FMLA. So what we call CFRA and FEMLA here in the office. And of course, you're familiar with those that provide the 12 weeks of unpaid job protected time for eligible employees for their or for them or their family's serious health condition. Now, keep in mind though that these serious health conditions can be exacerbated by natural disasters. So, for example, if I'm an employee and I have a respiratory illness, guess what? If there's a wildfire nearby and there's a lot of smoke going on, it's going to cause me to have some issues and possibly be absent from work and invoke some of these protections. So be aware of what CFRA and FMLA apply, and also that in the event of wildfires, some of your employees may have to invoke these protections or may be eligible for these protections either for themselves or to help a family member that has been affected by that natural disaster or whose condition has been affected by the natural disaster. Next leave of absence we have to consider is the school activities leave. Now, usually when we talk about this one, we talk about, parents going on kids to, the school Christmas program or graduations or field trips or that sort of thing. However, this also applies if there's a closure of the child's school or daycare due to a natural disaster. So, if or any kind of emergency condition situation, if you will. So if there's a lockdown at the school and they have to close down early, guess what? Your employee is protected to go deal with that without any kind of adverse action, right? So again, if they have to close down your child's daycare or your child's school due to a natural disaster, then the employee is afforded some time off to go deal with that. Now, as an employer, you can require that your employee use their vacation for that time, as well as require documentation for attendance purposes. And if you have both parents that work for you, you can limit so only one of them takes the time away, or one at a time takes the time away, as opposed to both of them leaving to deal with the situation. All right, so keep that in mind. A lot of times we hear about closures of schools or daycares or anything due to natural disasters. So these could have an effect on your employees, and any time they need to deal with it, as long as they can document it, would be without any kind of repercussions or adverse actions at work. Other leaves to consider, of course, is the emergency service leave, and this is for, volunteer firefighters, volunteer law enforcement, etc., that may be called into action whenever there is a natural disaster. Emergency service training, of course, if you have any kind of emergency personnel on or volunteer personnel that work for you, whether it's firefighters, first responders, whatever it is, they are protected from taking some time away. If you have 50 or more employees, they can take up to 14 calendar days a year for training. The Civil Air Patrol, not something we hear about a lot, but this is also something that if you have 16 or more employees, they are able to take up to 10 days of leave per year. And then there's also accommodations under FEHA and the Americans with Disabilities Act. So in other words, this again could affect employees that have health conditions due to any kind of natural disaster. Again, wildfires come to mind. The doctor may say, hey, this employee has a medical condition that prevents him from performing their job duties during these conditions. And if that's a new employee, guess what? You can say, well, they don't qualify for CFRA and FMLA, but they are still protected under FEHA and ADA. So we'd have to enter the interactive process with them to see if there's any kind of accommodation, including a short leave of absence to deal with that. And of course, there's also your own PTO, vacation, or personal time off policies that will allow employees to take time away to deal with any kind of repercussions of the natural disaster, whether it's for them or a family member. Now, as an employer too, if you are affected, you may have some other resources or measures you may have to take to deal with the natural disaster, right? And sometimes, it does mean we have to temporarily shut down or even slow down our work because we've been affected by it. So, things that come to some options that we have for this are either furloughs or temporary shutdowns or layoffs, if you will, right? So now furloughs and layoffs are used interchangeably sometimes, the terms that is, but they are not necessarily the same. So, for instance, a furlough is basically an unpaid, should be seen as an unpaid leave of absence as opposed to a layoff, which is a termination of employment, right? A furlough means you intend to bring the employee back, but you only need them to be off of work for a specific amount of time. Or even if it's open ended, the fact of the matter is, we're furloughing you, but you're still an employee with us. You're still in our books. We haven't separated. It's just no work available right now. Okay. Um, and a lot of times, during a furlough, employers may continue to provide any kind of medical benefits to their employees. A layoff is an actual separation from work. In other words, we're cutting ties because there is no work available right now or because we've been affected by this natural disaster. So there's no intention or no guarantee, or you're not even sure if you're going to bring the employee back, right? All you know is that you're terminating, you're separating right now, and whatever happens, happens in the future. So in other words, if it is a separation, you do have to process their final check, give them all the right paperwork. It's a termination as opposed to a furlough, which is just like a leave of absence at the point, right? Now, if it is a layoff, of course, healthcare benefits do terminate, and the employee is eligible for COBRA or Cal COBRA to continue their coverage on their own after work. Now, sometimes employers don't want to furlough or lay off, or don't want to lay off employees, and again, that's where that furlough comes in, right? Basically, what you're just reducing the workload for a specified amount of time. So what that could mean is, um, due to this natural disaster, we have to shut our doors for the next week, so there's no work for the next week. We're furloughing everybody for a week. That means there is no work for everybody for a week, but at the end of it, we intend to bring everybody back. Or what we saw a few years back in the state of California was there was a furlough Friday, right? Employees were furloughed where they didn't come to work every other Friday for us, for a few months in order to cut back on expenses or cut back on work or because there was no work available. Or there could be a reduction in hours for a certain amount of time. So in other words, for a furlough, employees do still stay on your payroll, or they could be unpaid, or you reduce the hours, but they're still active employers for you. Now, a furlough doesn't have to be across the board. You can target specific departments or specific employees. Just make sure that, you are using sound business reasons in deciding who is going to be affected by it. In other words, we're not going to say, I'm going to furlough everybody over the age of, 50 because of the smoke issue. That's kind of discriminatory. Well, there's no kind of about it. That is discriminatory. So make sure that you're using sound business decisions. In other words, you could say, well, since we are not getting any new materials, we're going to furlough everybody in our receiving department for the next week. Right? That makes more sense to cross the board. It's the whole business unit as opposed to pointing out a specific protected group. Now, when it comes to furloughing, you can also furlough employees that are exempt, but keep in mind when doing so, you can't jeopardize their exempt status. In other words, if I say I'm going to furlough all my exempt employees every Friday and I'm going to cut their pay accordingly, guess what? All of a sudden, it makes it seem like they're paid by the hour or by the day as opposed to being paid a set salary. So be aware of that, when you're dealing with exempt employees. If you're furloughing them, um, think through if it's gonna have any effect on their wages or salaries, because you could put yourself in a position where they no longer are exempt employees, and then they could be subject to overtime and meal and rest period breaks and other protections as well. So now again, a furlough is basically an unpaid leave of absence, right? So what we have to do is provide employees with certain notices when we are furloughing them. So you have to give them their some information about unemployment, because at the end of the day, if they are furloughed, they're not working, so they are eligible for some they could be eligible for unemployment benefits. Now, if it is going to affect their benefits as well, then you should provide them with COBRA notices so that they know how to continue their benefits during that time. And You may have to provide them their final paycheck if that furlough is going to extend beyond a certain amount of time. So again, if you're just furloughing everybody for 1 week, that may not be the case. But if you're doing it for 2 weeks, 10 days, whatever it is, then you should treat it almost like you're treating a separation, right? Say, hey, you know what? There's not going to be any work for the next 3 weeks. We're going to put everybody off. Here's your pay for all the work you've done up to date. At the end of 3 weeks, we're going to give everybody a call, let you know where we are, probably call you back. Okay? So again, you know, make sure that if it's going to be an extended furlough, that you are providing that final pay to your employees. And again, for a furlough, if it's going to be beyond the next pay period or going more than 10 days, then you should kind of treat that final pay as a termination. Again, you're not separating with the employee, but if the furlough is going to go beyond the next pay period or be longer than 10 days, on the day that you're furloughing everybody on the last day of work, you should provide them their final or their pay up until that date so they have it then, right? Again, just to recap, you should pay the final check on the last day worked before the furlough. Failure to do so can subject you to waiting time penalties similar to a termination. If you terminate somebody and don't have the final check on time, you're going to get waiting time penalties. Guess what? The same rules apply for a furlough if it's going to go beyond 10 days. So, if you just foresee having to furlough everybody for 1 week, you should be fine. But again, if it's going to go beyond 10 days or beyond the pay period, have everybody's final pay on their last day. Now we talked about furloughs and layoffs. There are some other options, one of which is the work sharing program. So basically what this is the program by the EDD, the Unemployment Department for California. And what this does is it allows you to cut back hours, but makes employees eligible for partial unemployment benefits. So you could be asking yourself, well, what's the benefit of that to me, right? Is it going to affect my unemployment rating? What do employees get out of it? Well, think of it, you have to think of the big picture on that one. I mean, it allows you to keep your employees, right? Because they're still being made somewhat whole. I mean, they're losing a little bit because, it's they're not getting full benefits, but at the same time they are getting some kind of wage replacement for their time missed. So you don't have to worry about rehiring new people. You don't have to worry about the training costs. You don't have to worry about the ramp up. You don't have to worry about, losing any kind of knowledge that you would lose with losing employees, right? Minimize the need for layoffs, that sort of thing. So it's a good option if you like your team, if you like the employees you have, and you don't want to go through the pain of having to ramp up after a layoff or after a furlough, right? You could look into work sharing. And the way it works, it is a program by the EDD, so you have to apply for it online. There's an application for it, and there's also ongoing reporting requirements for you as an employer. You have to report the hours worked, employees, so on and so forth, and submit those to the EDD as well, right? So again, it could be a little cumbersome, and this would usually fall in either the office administrator, payroll, and or human resources to do these reports. But again, you have to think, weigh the pros and cons. I mean, obviously, there's more paperwork, but the pro of it is you do get to keep your employees, and when you're ready to ramp up again, they are ready to go again. Okay. Finally, the following thing to consider too in event of natural disasters, employee relations. So in other words, how can we help our employees beyond the paycheck, beyond the leave of absence? What else can we do for them during a natural disaster? A lot of companies do have an employee assistance program or an EAP as part of their benefits package, which does provide another level of help for their employees. Now they can, call the EAP and get either counseling, financial legal services, educational programs, critical incident response, basically other things that would not be covered just by regular, medical insurance or dental insurance. There are other things in which they can be helped using an EAP. So if you don't have a employee assistance program as part of your benefits right now, maybe something to consider, something to look for when you are looking to renew your benefits or when it's open enrollment. Could be something you can add to have another basically another layer of help for your employees moving forward. Something else to consider too, if there is a natural disaster, is remote or hybrid work. Now, I know this is not always possible for different jobs or different duties, right? So, in other words, if you're a manufacturing facility, it's kind of hard to tell people, hey, take the press home or you know, take the conveyor belt home and work from home. It's not a thing. But for other jobs, for administrative jobs or other positions, it could be possible to work remotely, even on a temporary basis, or work in a hybrid model where they only come into the office 1 day a week and work from home the rest of the time. So again, this could be something that keep your operations going during a natural disaster when you cannot access the regular workplace. So it's another option, look at remote or hybrid work as a way to keep the doors open, so to speak, right? And what this does, is basically it minimizes the interruption as much as possible. Okay. So, the thing to keep in mind too is if you do institute remote or hybrid work and you have those non-exempt employees, those hourly employees that are working remotely, make sure that they are aware that wage and hour rules still apply. So, in other words, they have to clock in and out. They still have to take their breaks and their meals on time. They're still subject to overtime. So, they should still work their scheduled hours as you schedule it to them and nothing beyond that. And of course, you have to make sure that any kind of privacy and safety protocols are still in place. So, in other words, if HR is going to work remotely, that doesn't mean that I get to take all the employee files home and just leave them laying around my house, right? Where anybody could come in and see them and access employee personal information. So make sure that if you are going to institute remote or hybrid work, that you take, you know, the confidentiality and the safety of employee and company information into mind. So we do, we can help with remote work agreements if you have any questions about it. Obviously, we can't create one for you, but if you are going to have employees work remotely or work in a hybrid type scenario for an amount of time, make sure you do put that in writing as far as what the responsibilities are of the employee, the duration of the arrangement, so on and so forth. You want to outline as much as possible so that there are no questions should you need to end the arrangement or should anything change. All right, so to wrap up, what do we have to do to be prepared for those natural disasters in the state of California? So the first one is, be prepared, follow all the health, safety, and pay requirements during natural disasters. Again, we talked a little bit about the wage and hour. um, you know, be aware of any kind of information the state puts out as far as, natural disaster declarations, emergency declarations, whatever it is, and what that means to your job sites or your employees. Make sure supervisors are trained how to handle paid sick leave, protected leaves, vacation, and other time off requests. Not just during natural disasters, but in general. Usually we find that it's those middle management, those supervisors that sometimes get us in trouble because they don't know how to respond to these things correctly, so they just deny them, right? So again, make sure you provide training to your supervisors so they know how to handle those requests. And if they don't know how to handle them, make sure that they are reaching out to you or somebody else in management to make the right decision. And, you know, anytime natural disaster strikes, we have to pivot sometimes. So make sure you're looking at all options for providing employee flexibility and to keep working. It's important to minimize the disruption as much as possible, right? I mean, this is not only good for our employees, but it's good for our business in the long term. So, again, I know I've thrown a lot of information at you. So, if you have any questions, you can reach out to us. I do have a general number there, but we do prefer if you're in Ventura County, you can give us a call at the hotline specifically for you have any questions about what are your wage and hour responsibilities in natural disaster. Do I have to pay my employees for the full day? Do I have to pay them if I shut the doors? How much do I pay them? Whatever it is, give us a call. We could talk through that and give you the right information for it. If you do want anything beyond the hotline, we do offer different membership options to CEA, ranging from monthly associate all the way to our ultimate. And that ultimate's good because I mean, look at the size of that list. You got a lot of benefits there. So just kidding. But anyways, if you do want anything beyond the hotline, take a look. there are other options available for you. If you find yourself in a situation where you need more HR help, maybe your, HR generalist or HR director had to take a leave of absence or step away for a while, or you're in between HR people, we can help with that too. We do offer HR Assist, where a member of our team can, step into those shoes for a limited amount of time and act as your HR department to keep things going. And if you're a business owner, to make sure that you're not dealing with all the HR issues, as fun as those may be sometimes. Now, Anna did promise you a chance to give us some feedback, so here is the link to that. You could take a snapshot of that QR code and it'll take you to those 5 very short questions. Most of them are multiple choice, and if you want to add some comments about what you liked, what you didn't like, or what you'd like to hear about in the future, that is your chance to do so. Again, very short survey, and we do really appreciate any kind of feedback. Take it to heart and share it with our partners over in Ventura to make sure that we are providing you what you need. And finally, for those of you that are with us for continuing education, we do have some codes for you. For HRCI credits, the code is 742601. That's 742601. And for SHRM, that's 26-2 EPCV. That's 26-2 eggplant, potato, carrot, vegetable. Let's be healthy. So we're talking about veggies today. If you don't know how to use those codes, give us a call. We can help you. But if you are, already in continuing education with SHRM or HRCI, you know what I'm talking about. So for that, I'll hand it over back to Anna to wrap us up or see if there's any questions out there.
I always wonder what you're going to do creatively with that SHRM code, and we got a nice little reminder to eat our
That's it.
our
Eat your
greens and
veggies.
our eat our colors today. So thank you for
Mhm.
that, Eli, as well as this lovely training to help us all prepare for hopefully not what we have to put into practice, but to always be prepared to take care of our teams and ourselves. I do want, if you have not been following along in the chat, I've been providing lots of links for you. So make sure you click through and open up whatever tabs you need to before we sign off. But I do want to just draw your attention to a couple things because Eli did a wonderful job wrapping us up. However, I do want to make sure that you see the link for the next training that's coming up on June 16th. That is called Recruiting, Hiring, and Employing Minors. This is, again, if you have opportunities for, teenagers, summer jobs are coming up, over the holiday season. So that will just help you make sure that you are compliant, give you some tips with, communicating and managing employees of that generation. So definitely check that one out. Again, that is compliments of our partners over at Ventura County. So again, thank you to Micah for joining us at the beginning. Thank you to your entire team for everything that you do and for sponsoring not just trainings like this, but your complimentary HR hotline. Make sure you reach out to them for additional resources to help you run your departments and organizations with ease. And we look forward to talking with you on that HR hotline. If you're able, that's 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Friday Pacific time. So with that, thank you again, Eli, for leading us. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy day, and we look forward to seeing you on that next training on June 16th. Thanks, everyone. Cheers.